crisis. Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and thanks to my daughter Kate for developing the intro to the Practical Wisdom for Leaders podcast, where we offer a smart, fast-paced discussion on leadership, communication, and technologies enabling disruption. My guests help us explore timely topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. If you've not done so, please click subscribe so you automatically and seamlessly stay in the know when we publish new episodes. Likewise, please provide me with feedback. What do you like? What do you dislike? And what else would you like to know? And now, today's episode. My guest today is Diane Dixon. Diane, I think we have known each other now for probably 15 or 16 years.
I would say that's accurate.
Yes, and so I'm excited today. We reconnected probably about a month and a half ago just to catch up, and then you started telling me about some of the research you've been doing, and I think our listeners would be fascinated about this research.
What I've been looking at, or what I recently conducted research on, was, how did racially and ethnically diverse CEOs navigate to that level? What were the lessons learned so that I could translate that into practical tips that could help people who are interested in that. So a little bit about me. Let's see. So I've been in the field of leadership and organizational learning for 30 plus years. And as you said, I met you, Scott, through the International Leadership Association. And at that time, when I first joined that organization, I was actually working on my doctorate, focusing on transformational leadership, which is my interest and my passion. I'm a leadership and organization development consultant, advisor, author of a new book, Diversity on the Executive Path, which is what I was just referring to when I was talking about the research. I think that's basically it. I'm a good friend. I'm a godmother, a daughter of a 95-year-old mother.
Well, let's talk about the research. Let's talk about the book, and maybe we could even explore just 3 or 4 findings or interesting things that you came upon in that work.
Okay. I've been pondering for years after I finished my doctorate. When I did my doctorate, I focused on, my dissertation was on hospital CEOs, transformational leadership, and how that correlated with hospital performance. There was no diversity in my study. And there were a lot of reasons. Back then, there was even less diversity then than there is now in the C-suite of hospitals and health systems.
Wow.
So finally, after pondering that and teaching healthcare leadership and communications for a few years in the Master of Health Administration program, University of Maryland School of Public Health, I said, I really want to find out who are the healthcare CEOs, racially and ethnically diverse CEOs. How did they navigate there? How did they get there? I did qualitative research, phenomenological study, lived experiences of 12 CEOs. And in that study, 4 African Americans, 4 Latinx or Hispanics, men and women both, and 4 Asian Americans. And so equal amount of women and men in each of those, in those categories. And basically what I did is, I'm really simplifying all that it took to get to identify them and also to get them to agree to sit down with me. Part interviews, 1.5 hours for each. So a total of 3 hours of interviewing face-to-face to learn just that. How did they, navigate? What were the lived experiences that they had along that executive path that facilitated their trajectory to the C-suite? And so that was, that's a short form of what the study entailed, and I will be forever grateful to them for agreeing to spend that amount of time to share their stories, which were just really fascinating. So what I did with the research, after I got all the stories, I and went through the typical research methodology process and identifying those themes. I looked at the common themes among those 12 CEOs, and it was interesting. They had a lot in common. Really, what I found was sponsorship really made the significant difference.
Well, so tell me how you're distinguishing between those two terms. I think that's interesting.
Mentorship is, or a mentor, I'll just start there, is someone who supports you during your career, someone that you can trust, someone who may have more experience than you and who can provide guidance. And as I said before, support on the career journey. Very important. And by the way, they all had mentors and identified mentors as being a significant component of their career trajectory. What I heard, though, which was interesting, is about sponsorship. And sponsorship is what's different is that a sponsor will actually put you in a position. Suggest that you be on a high visibility board or task force or committee or team in the health system. They are introducing you to other executive leaders who are facilitating your career. They give you, most importantly, too, leadership opportunities that help you to grow. And you and I know about 70% of effective leadership development is really what happens on the job.
Yeah, so it's much more of an active role. A sponsor it's almost an advocate in a way, an advocate for your career. Is that accurate?
I would say an advocate, yes. And just as the term suggests, really sponsoring you, that they actively are giving you that opportunity for that job to coordinate the merger integration task force, for example. Yep. Or putting you in that department where a department head just left and say, you now take over that department in the interim. And this, I'm thinking about somebody early in their career who may not have led a department before, but here's an opportunity to do that in an interim way and demonstrate your leadership, your ability to mobilize a team and move towards achieving collective goals. Those were some of the stories that I heard.
Sure. So it's stretch assignments. It's in some ways, and we just said it. I mean, it's advocating. And so tell me a couple stories that really stood out for you when it comes to this topic of sponsorship. What did some of these CEOs say that maybe even caught you by surprise or just was highly interesting for you?
I think a thread that ran through all of the stories were the positions that sponsors put them in, and so often they were positions that they had not had experience in before. And having to work through the inner emotion of saying, can I do this? I've never done this before. Am I going to fail? How, should I take this on? And, all those cases, they did take it on and were able to demonstrate that. But I think that was an interesting thread, that they were often given opportunities that they had not had experience in before and really just jumped in. Now, I think the important point here is they weren't just put in and then left to fail, per se. They were put in, but they had the guidance and the support of the sponsor. Often the sponsor is a boss in many situations that do that. So they had that support and guidance, and they also had the mentors who they could go talk to, as they were figuring out, what to do in these positions. I think the other interesting point about their stories and sponsorship were the times that they really had where they struggled.
Yeah.
Because, everything isn't perfect on the executive path. And there were times when they took positions, and I can think of a story of one of the women who was given a very, very tough health system, multi-hospital health system, and she was asked to take the leadership of a very difficult situation, hospital that was having financial difficulties with physicians. And she took that on. She did very well. And then the strategic direction of that hospital was shifted, which caused her some issues. And she had to discern again, whether do I stay in this? Now that the path that this hospital is going in, that was shifted by that same CEO who had been a sponsor throughout her career.
Yeah.
And had been responsible for putting her in various positions where she had been very successful, which is why he asked her to take on this very difficult situation, which she was turning around, but then for whatever reason, he shifted what he was expecting. And that created some difficulties, I think, in this case, particularly with physicians. So she made a decision.
Everything you're saying is reminding me of this article that I've used in class for years. And Michael Lombardo from the Center for Creative Leadership at the time, and Robert Eichinger, and I think it was called 88 Assignments for Development in Place. And what's interesting is, I don't know if you've ever come across this article, Diane, but it's really fascinating. I'll make sure that it's in the show notes.
Oh, but good.
They highlight 11 developmental challenges that, again, if we have an opportunity to make meaning of these experiences, and if we want to develop, I forget what the exact, is it CCL that says, it's 70% experience, yes. 20%, I forget what the 20% is, 10% classroom, but it's a 70-20-10. I'll also put that in the show notes. They basically had these 11 developmental challenges. And so I'm hearing some of those in what you're saying. Success or failure are both possible and will be obvious to others. That's 1. Requires aggressive individual take charge leadership. That's 2. Involves working with new people, a lot of people, or both. Creates additional personal pressure. Requires influencing people, activities, and factors over which the manager has no direct authority or control. Involves high variety. Will be closely watched by people whose opinions count. Requires building a team, starting something from scratch, or fixing a turnaround. Has a major strategic component, involves interacting with an especially good or bad boss, and then something important is missing and they need to fill it. So I'm hearing shades of some of that article in what you're finding, and it's fascinating how they mirror one another.
Yes, I would agree with that, Scott. I think all that you said in those 11 developmental challenges certainly were faced by the participants in this study. It was interesting when you talked about the boss. And, I had said a few minutes ago that in many cases, the bosses were also sponsors.
Yeah.
There were times when bosses, even though they may have been sponsors in terms of, giving them opportunities to lead, at times the bosses were also challenges. And I presented challenges, and I heard that in many of the stories. And how did they do that? And I think the persistent theme among all of them, and I have a whole section in the book about these different types of personalities, is that they stuck with them, that they found a way to manage the relationship. I can remember one story where the CEO earlier in his career said he had to understand how that boss learned and received information, and how that was different from how he delivers information and how he correlates and pulls together information. And so he became very aware of that and said, you have to really understand that. And he shifted, and that made a significant difference in their relationship. They were really at odds until he was willing to really get that self-awareness and also open up to learning rather than focusing on the negativities that were developing in that relationship. How can I work with him?
Yeah.
How can I make this work? And he did.
I say this sometimes, I do some work in healthcare as well, and I often will say I can't think of a more difficult context to lead in from a day-to-day basis than healthcare. Whether it's the regulations, whether it's, if there's a mistake, it wasn't, sorry, I put cheese on your burger.
Right.
It was, we were supposed to do surgery on the left leg, it's that type of stuff. And so whether it's the regulations or whether it's the 24/7 nature of the work, the complexity, technology, innovation. I mean, there's so much baked into that whole leadership role. I mean, these men and women are heroic in their ability to lead these very, very complex, challenging. Can you think of have you worked with an organization that's a more difficult context than healthcare?
It's nonstop. It is, I think, from my experience, both my own personal professional experience of working in a couple of corporations, consulting, I would say that hospitals and health systems, just as you described, are extremely demanding and complex organizations.
Yeah.
Very, adaptive systems, really, complex adaptive systems that often sometimes are still in that bureaucratic, hierarchical, traditional way of operating, but yet they are complex adaptive systems. So there's that tension that's going on, I think, between that as they're growing and learning. So I think you're right about that. And I would say now, of course, in the midst of COVID-19, and I've been listening into American College of Healthcare Executives, have been interviewing varieties of CEOs and just hearing, how are they navigating all of this? Just amazing stories. So you have an already very complex and demanding system that now has become even more complex and demanding. And the importance of learning in this, learning in the moment and quickly adapting. And I think that, and as I'm listening to these current stories, I think that's the huge lesson. I think you got to adapt very, very quickly. I want to go back to the minority CEOs, the racial and ethnic diverse CEOs for a minute and talk about them in this context of demanding and complex hospitals and health systems. I think for them, in the stories that I heard, they have all of that any CEO has, all of this that they're doing, leading and managing all of these dynamic issues going on all at once in people's lives and the community being so much the center and purpose of their work. But as Black and brown people, they have the additional challenge of navigating in systems that still are struggling, as we are very much today we're talking about and recognizing systemic issues of racism and the need for more diversity and inclusion, which is a big opportunity now, and particularly the American College of Healthcare Executives is really working with this. The American Hospital Association with their Institute for Diversity and Health Equity are working with this. So in all of these cases, these men and women, diverse men and women, were able to, that did not hinder their careers. And I think that's notable. Not all of them, but many of them talked about some of those challenges. But all of them were able to manage that and not let any of those disparities or stereotypes or microaggressions diminish their careers.
Will you tell us some stories? What did you hear from them about some of what they experienced?
Well, I think about one. I was just popped in my head. One gentleman who I'd say probably he was mid-career. He was the only African American in that particular department or division. I think at that point it was a division. And he talked about what that's like and needing to, not everyone believing that he could do the job, not everybody believing that he belonged there.
Wow.
And needing to be, to demonstrate that I have to be the best of the best. I really have to be really top notch in my performance and in my work. And also, and that was shared, I think, in other stories too, and also the importance of developing relationships, recognizing that so much of misunderstanding is rooted in people not having the experience of meeting people who are different than them, and in the importance of developing relationships and not focusing on, as one of the women said, if I focused on every microaggression. And this is an African-American woman. And I've told a story about a Latina who had an interesting kind of blatant experience. But anyway, back to what that quote, she said, if I focused on that every day, I couldn't do my job. I'm here to do a job. I'm here to serve this community. I'm here to serve the patients. I'm here to work with the staff. So I need to focus on that. And I think all of them in their own way spoke to that they focused on their work and they were very purpose driven. I want to tell a really difficult story where a physician this was a Latina woman who came into a situation, hospital, and again, it's physician challenges. And there was one physician in this particular department, the performance was poor. There had been complaints of not just performance in terms of clinical performance, but also complaints in terms of his particular behavior. So she had the job of performance management in that feedback. And essentially, because of the nature of those clinical results, closing down that particular specialty, surgical specialty.
Okay.
And so he threatened her and he actually said to her, you know what your problem is? I'm going to have you fired. Your problem is your race and your gender.
Wow.
He actually said that to her. And her response was, I'm sorry you feel that way. I understand your feelings. My role here is to serve the patients. We're here to do our best to serve our patients. And that is what I need to do here. And that's why I'm doing it.
I was recording a podcast with Stephanie Johnson, I think a couple days ago, and she wrote a book called Inclusify. She's at the University of Colorado.
Okay.
And we were reflecting, she was sharing some stories that it's just hard to believe it still exists. It's hard to believe. But these men and women kind of consistently, would you say, Diane, experienced this as they were rising through the ranks? All of them had stories of this nature, whether it was microaggressions or outright just...
Yeah. Not all of them. It's interesting. And I was very careful with that when I asked the question, did your race or ethnicity affect, and that wasn't the exact question, but affect your career trajectory? And not all of them said that. It was interesting. There are a couple of incidents where they were not the minority, that there was one incident where the woman was not there was a high level of diversity in the public health system that she worked in.
Yeah. So
she felt as though she didn't really experience what others might experience who were in a less diverse. There was a story where Hispanic community, where again, this gentleman said, I'm not a minority in this community. Yeah. So I really haven't experienced, that in terms of impacting my career. It was interesting, the example of the Latina that I talked about, when I asked her that question, she said it was really gender that impacted her during her career trajectory more so than her ethnicity. So not all of them spoke in terms of that, and not all of them had those kinds of, of the story that I just recounted, blatant experiences. But the others who did say, I did have some experiences along the way, as I was just alluding to, they were less blatant than that. They were more microaggressions, or people just hadn't had the experience of working with Asian American woman. And I say that this particular woman said that someone said to her in one of her situations, very successful, had been CEO in several organizations, that they're really not ready for you here. So they really aren't ready for you. They've never had anyone like you here. And she was an interesting person because she really didn't talk a lot about her race and gender. She told her, they walked through their entire career trajectory. We just took their resume and I asked information, tell you a story about that position. She didn't talk about it that much as she was telling her story. She looked back and she said, when I asked her, because I didn't ask about race and ethnicity early in the interviews. That was the second part. And so she said, when I thought about that, because this was a 2-part interview, and in that case, I had traveled. So I'm seeing her on the second day. And she said, when I thought about this, when they said that to me, they're not ready for you. Maybe that was something to do with my race and my gender. But she said at the time that happened, she really wasn't thinking about that. And she was very, one of the ones who talked a lot about the other example I gave, the African-American woman as an Asian-American woman. If I focused on my race and, my gender I just didn't focus on it. I focused on my work. I focused on what I needed to do to serve this community, to serve the people. So just interesting. I don't know whether I answered your question.
You did. Well, and what other themes came up in your research?
I think one of the key themes is their ability to learn. These people were really learning leaders, as Peter Vail, I think, used that term.
Sure.
Learning leaders. They really demonstrate that. I mean, as they talked about their stories, going through their resumes, everything pointed to their ability to learn and to learn quickly and to adapt.
Okay.
So that's another thing, to adapt to the variety of situations that they were in, and as they made those moves along the career path. So learning and adaptability. And I think the other is resilience and mettle. I think they kind of go together. Mettle being the kind of the courage to stick with it in tough situations.
Yeah.
They all demonstrated that. And finding in that, I heard even in the stories that were, the difficult situations or the difficult boss, I did not hear anger. I heard forgiveness.
Wow.
I heard forgiveness. I heard, what did I learn from that? So again, back to that, I learned so much from that situation, or I learned so much from working with him, even though he was difficult or she was difficult. I just look back at how I'm so glad I stuck with it, resilience, mettle. I had the courage to, like the situation of, firing a doctor, or shutting down a service. I had the courage to do it. So those are some of the other common themes. And I think too, taking risk.
Okay.
As I said, they were so often put in, particularly as they were in the earlier stages and maybe even in the mid-career, put in positions where they didn't have, a great deal of experience, but yet they had demonstrated so much potential that the sponsor said, go do this.
Yeah.
And that came up several times. They said, just go do it. And I said, I'm going to go do it. I'm going to try it. I'm going to do my best and see what happens. And this is actually a quote. I did it and I was successful.
Wow.
So that kind of spirit, that kind of initiative, that kind of mindset, I think really helped them to, move on the executive path.
Yeah. So tell me next step.
It's out there. It's the Health Administration Press.
Okay. We will make sure that that's in the show notes. What else are you thinking about right now?
Well, I'm continuing to think about leadership in the context of the time we're in now. COVID-19, what's been going on in our country in terms of, since the George Floyd's death, we all witnessed it multiple times on social media and TV and other Blacks who have died in police custody. So I'm greatly disturbed about that. And so that takes me to thinking about how can leaders in the organizational context.
Okay.
Because if it's going on outside, if people are talking about it, and it is being talked everywhere, it's everywhere being talked about. Racism now has, it's been undiscussable. It's now all over social media and everywhere. How can leaders talk about that, open up and create cultures within their organizations where people feel safe to talk about what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and turn that into really productive conversations, not just productive. How do we, in the healthcare context, health equity? How do we achieve health equity for all? And I think all hospitals across this country, through the AHA, American Hospital Association, and American College of Healthcare Executives, who have, that is a key goal, health equity for all. How do we really achieve that? And how do we, all of this that we're going through right now in our country, how do we acknowledge what's going on in the communities that we serve? How do we talk about that within our organizations in a way that helps us to achieve that health equity for all, emphasis for all strategy? And how do we make more of a social impact in our community? So that's on my mind, and I've even I'm proposing writing an article about that. That's under consideration right now, and that's all I'll say about that. Yeah. But I'll say a little bit more. I'll say that I talked to a couple of leaders who are doing that.
Okay,
have done that.
Yeah,
they did it right after George Floyd and the protests. They immediately did that. And then I just read it. Someone sent me an article about another CEO who wrote a compelling letter through his health system acknowledging this, and who are we and what are we going to do? And why are we here to serve? So that's what I want to, that's what I'm thinking about, and that's what I'm hoping I'm going to write about and get published sometime before the end of the year. And I think that's, I think that top of my mind. I just think we have such an opportunity in leadership and in the field of leader and leadership development to help leaders to do these difficult, they deal with these difficult realities that we seem to be faced with now in our country. And I know that there've been other periods of time in history when there's been difficulty, but it just seems like in my memory, and I think I'm a little older than you are, this seems to be an extremely difficult time most difficult time that I feel like I'm experiencing. And so I think about how can we help in our field? What can we do to help leaders and leadership in this time to address these issues? And we know that our organizations, whether it's healthcare or whatever organization is an open system.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes what we do internally is to say, well, that's out there, all that, this is, it's in the news, and there's maybe a fear is a strong word, but some of this fear, if we open that up internally and start talking about that, how will I handle that? What will I do with that? What do we do? So I think that's where we have a lot of opportunity now, leadership being just so challenging in the midst of all of this, in these times, to really, how do we help? How do we make a difference in our field, enhancing leader and leadership development to really, I think to say it sounds like almost a cliche to lead in challenging times. So I don't, it's not a cliche.
Yeah.
It's a reality. It's harder than ever.
Yeah.
And are there new competencies that are emerging and we're learning very quickly that leaders need to be, not only do, because I think about doing, but what do leaders need to be?
Yeah.
As people.
Yeah.
To be able to lead effectively and help the people that their teams that they're leading cope and to be effective.
It's such a important topic. I said the other day on an episode, I heard from a listener, I think I said something to the effect of, because we were talking about this conversation, potentially the gap that exists between a lot of the traditional leadership theories, like transformational leadership,
yes,
that was developed by white men, studied on white men, and the research was analyzed by white men, and the gap that can exist, and the gap potentially for leadership educators in facilitating some of these conversations. And I think I made the comment that I felt a little bit unprepared to do so. And that has levels to that comment that I just made. But I heard from a listener, and she sent me some material, and it was really, really helpful. I literally, she sent it to me, and I sat there and I read the document she sent, and there were some really nice tools about how to think about some of those conversations or facilitating some of that dialogue. Stephanie Johnson, who I mentioned a little bit ago, she said, it's about creating space where people can be authentic and honest and humble, and creating an authentic space for that conversation. But as you were speaking, I was thinking of, I watched the documentary on Congressman Lewis, The Good Trouble. I'd never seen images of men and women being pulled off of stools at some of the sit-ins and having food thrown on them, and these graphic images of hatred. And of course, we saw those images again in recent months.
Yes.
And I think you're exactly right. I think you're spot on. How do we help as leadership educators, the process of influencing others towards a common vision? How do we help others navigate some of those complexities? Because it's complex, it's adaptive, it's a wicked problem, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think when you talked about leader, the theories and that we teach, and white men, who writes the books, the books with textbooks that we use. And, how do we change that? Jean Lao Chin, who you may know, I suggest her work because she's done some work in this area about diversity leadership and speaks to this and has done research on that. I'll have to send you, I didn't bring that down in the things that I thought I might refer to in talking about this, but talking about diverse leaders and how do we include them in the conversation too, including them when we talk about leadership and what does leadership need to be and what do leaders need to be and do in these times. And then to speak to your comment about conversations, I mean, I feel the same way you do about, being equipped to facilitate, these difficult conversations. And by the way, there's a book on that, and that's called Difficult Conversations. There is a book, Courageous Conversations, about schools. I see it, but I don't want to get up because I'll have to unplug. But his name is Glenn Singleton. And I need to really go. I've actually borrowed it because of this article that I'm hoping to write and get published about conversations on racism as it relates to health equity. So, but he's written about that and ways to do that. So you might want to take a look at that in terms of school equity, which is certainly an issue, an opportunity for us, an adaptive challenge.
Yep.
So I think you're right, Scott. I think that we in our field, we are learning and have opportunities to continue to learn and create I don't like the word tools because it sounds so mechanistic, but what can we do to support? What books, what handouts, what can we develop that we can, our students, our clients, our community, our friends, that will help them to become comfortable with having conversations like this. I think that's the key. I think in my life experience, so much misunderstanding, I think, comes from just not listening and learning and exposure and willingness to open up to hear diverse or different opinions or different outlooks on things. I said to a friend last night, talking about some things that are going on, and so there are people who have a different lens that they're looking through.
Yeah. And
so rather than criticizing that lens, how do we learn to seek to understand that lens?
Yep.
This is Stephen Covey, seek to understand rather than to be understood. And how do we do that? And how do we teach others to do that?
Yeah.
And how do we teach that?
Yep.
How do we facilitate that? How do we create spaces, as you were referring to Stephanie Johnson, that enables people to feel comfortable and that this is space that I can trust,
Yeah.
that I can be honest about what I'm thinking and I'm feeling.
Yeah.
So we have, I think the good news about all of this that we're experiencing now is that we have so much opportunity to be helpful.
Yeah.
And to serve.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of learning that can happen, and hopefully that learning turns then into action. But your comments about listening, and we should close down a little bit. I think how long have we been going, Diane? Almost 45 minutes maybe?
I know we've been going.
But what I'm seeing in the system right now, I did this podcast with Tony Middlebrooks yesterday. We recorded it and we were talking on some of these types of issues, but there's just a lack of empathy, and right and wrong and good, bad, this, that. There isn't a lot of both and. There isn't a lot of, to your point, seek first to understand, to empathize, whether that's what people in urban America are experiencing. I think many areas of rural America are experiencing trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lack of empathy. And it's this tribalism that is going to get us nowhere. It's going to absolutely get us nowhere. We will rot from the inside.
I agree with you 100%, Scott.
And I don't understand the people who are bringing machine guns to the Capitol building of their states. But I'm trying to figure out what is their lived reality that is causing them to think that that's the good option in this moment.
Exactly.
I need to try and at least understand that, because there's something there. That's a result of something, right?
Something. Yes.
And I believe it's similar in a lot of what we've been discussing. How can I work to empathize and try and understand, even though it hasn't been my lived reality?
Yes.
There's something there that I have to pay attention to and I have to learn about, because it's unhealthy. It's not right.
I agree with you, Scott. And and when you talk about the machine guns, and I worry about what's has gone on recently in Chicago with the looting. And as the mayor and the police chief said, this is not peaceful protesting. Yeah. Where is that coming from? What is that about?
Yeah.
What is breaking into? I mean, and I understand it to some, anger. How do we channel? What do we need to do? Again, rather than criticizing that, what do we need to do? I mean, it's not right. It's wrong to be looting. That's not peaceful protesting. That's not the protest that John Lewis was doing.
Yeah, no.
Talking about and speaking about to the end of his life. That's not the peaceful protest that we saw, the Black Lives Matter protest, peaceful protest. So what do we do with the people? How do we seek to understand the people that are doing violence and looting randomly? What do we need to do to help them, to understand them, that motivation, and to help them to channel whatever that anger is, what that anger is about?
Yep, because there's a lot of anger. There's a lot of anger.
A lot of anger going around right now, all around. How do we channel that anger into something that is, again, understanding and positive and doing something positive for the greater good?
Yeah.
For the greater good. It's not just about what happened in my neighborhood and I'm angry about that. How can I think more about the greater good? And how can I demonstrate that what I believe was wrong in my neighborhood or what I believe is wrong in this country in a way that's positive and constructive, that will make differences in the community, policy differences, changes in policy, changes in systems, education, healthcare, all of the systems that, how food insecurity, all of these things, joblessness. How do we channel our upset, our dismay, our anger, and demonstrate that in a way that's constructive and purposeful
Yep.
to really make a difference that will be for the greater good. How do we reach the people with the guns? How do we reach the people who are looting and breaking store windows on the Magic Mile? How do we reach them?
Yeah.
How do we understand them? How do we help them?
Yep.
And when I say that now, I don't want that to be misunderstood as that, they certainly, when you commit a criminal act, when you do something that's wrong, we have systems, we want just systems to manage that, by the way.
Yep.
We want just systems, not unjust systems, which is part of the anger, that there is injustice, and certainly racial injustice and other injustices. How do we try to create ways that doesn't happen again?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of the system isn't working for a lot of people, and in increasingly large factions of different people, right?
Yes.
It's not working.
Yes.
And some of that is, I said this yesterday to Tony, some of that is long-term systemic horrible. Some of that is more recent because of offshoring or digitization. But the system as designed right now is yielding some results that are not healthy results, not sustainable. And I think we leave listeners on that right there, because that's a big question. That's a big question. And I don't purport to have the answer, but that's what I'm thinking about. Learning, reflecting, trying hard to empathize and understand what are the conditions that bring a group of human beings to feel like this is the option. Because that tells me that there's some conditions in place that aren't good. Right?
Yes, there are conditions in place that aren't good. And we have to look at those conditions.
Yeah.
And we have to, I want to go to John Lewis quote here as we're closing. We have to look at those conditions that are not good.
Yeah.
Honestly, we have to look at them honestly, not paint over them, not gloss over them, not make excuses for them, because if we make excuses, then we don't deal with the systemic issues, the root causes of those issues, and take a hard look at them and create ways to collectively and collaboratively to address them. And I agree with you, Scott, about we need to be better listeners and not criticizing, but saying, what do we do about this? And
it's easy for me to criticize. It's easy for me to criticize. I can go there quickly. It's harder for me to empathize and truly try and understand. That's harder work. It's more difficult.
Yes.
Tell me this quote.
Well, he said, this is the essay that he sent to the New York Times and told them to publish it after his death. And so it says, together you can redeem the soul of our nation. Though I am gone, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. And he said at the end, so I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide. Wow.
Let's end there. Diane, I can't thank you enough for this conversation today. It's the highlight of my day, the highlight of my week. It's been a lot of fun. It's been fun to reconnect with you, hear about your research. I go buy the book. There's a sale, and her research is awesome. And I loved that conversation. And then I loved our conversation this last 15, 20 minutes. And I think it's conversations like this where we learn, grow, and develop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott. This has been wonderful. Just wonderful being with you.
Yep. Be well. Take care.
Be well. Take care.
I have been reflecting quite a bit on my conversation with Diane. Really, it was almost kind of like two different podcasts with a similar theme in certain ways. But, our first part of our conversation was really about her research. And she's exploring how racially and ethnically diverse CEOs moved and kind of navigated their way into the C-suites. And she found a couple interesting things in her research with these CEOs that she interviewed. She discussed this notion of a sponsor or sponsorship. And this is different than a mentor, but a sponsor can really help place an individual into some of these positions where they can gain just critical experience. She found some other themes of, these individuals were learners, lifelong learners. They had mettle, they were resilient, and they were willing to jump into situations that they didn't know how they were going to turn out, but they took that risk and they put themselves in the position to be successful. Now, the second part of our conversation really focused on much of our current context. And it's been a theme in some recent podcasts exploring this notion of our current context. And I hope it's at least sparking some thoughts for each of you. But I will return to a central tenet of it seems that we have lost our ability to empathize with others, to seek to understand. That doesn't mean we have to agree, but can we at least explore both sides of an issue, really get clear, then identify our own values, and then act? And it's something I'm going to continue to explore and continue to think about. And I can't thank Diane enough for her willingness to jump in and have that conversation as well. So if you would, jump over to Amazon.com, Dr. Diane Dixon, her book, Diversity on the Executive Path. Take a look, explore, learn, and be well. Bye-bye, everybody.
You have been listening to the Practical Wisdom for Leaders podcast. If you liked what you heard, please share it with others and let them know what we're up to. And one last quick reminder to click subscribe so you know when we publish new episodes. And of course, we'd love to hear your feedback. You can stay in touch with me by visiting www.scottjallen.net or any number of social media platforms. Be well, be safe, and make a difference wherever you are on this beautiful planet. And now, here's Kate's twin sister, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.